Hello, and welcome to a special presentation on fraud and ransomware, how to identify and avoid common email threats. My name's Chris Ham. I'm a senior systems engineer with Premier One, and today I'm going to be taking you through various aspects of fraud and ransomware so that you can avoid them in your business. So many of you probably already are vaguely familiar, at least, with fraud, phishing, and ransomware. So I'm going to go through a few statistics on each of them. Fraud is a term used for activity meant to scam victims out of money. So the FBI in 2013 started tracking statistics on this and found that over $2.3 billion of losses had been reported since then in about a 3-year period. Many of these losses came about because of wire fraud attempts. Phishing is another form of cybercrime that is much related to fraud, but a little bit different. The idea here with phishing is to, instead of directly steal money, to instead steal information from victims. That information then often can be turned around and sold on the black market for a financial gain. So this would be things like credit card numbers, social security numbers, bank account information, things like that. A really important difference to note between fraud and phishing is that fraud is often very targeted. So an attempt might go directly to a specific person in a specific organization. Phishing, on the other hand, is often carried out by bulk email campaigns. And so the attacker will send out emails to thousands or sometimes even millions of potential victims, and all they need is for a very, very small percentage of those people to kind of fall for the scam and provide information. And then that information is turned around and sold. Something like a credit card credential could be purchased for a mere $4, or a bank account with $70,000 to $150,000 could be purchased for under $300, or even a full identity for just about $1,200. Ransomware is a bit different, and it's a newer form of cybercrime that has really taken off. The idea behind ransomware is to make your computer and data unusable. Unlike traditional viruses, ransomware really is more destructive in that it takes your data and scrambles it up and then holds it hostage and demands a ransom before it is unscrambled. So nowadays, most ransoms cost over $600. Some go even higher, even into the tens of thousands of dollars, as we've seen with a couple high-profile targets like hospitals. So, as I mentioned, ransomware is relatively new. It only became widespread around 2013, but since then it's really taken off. Estimated just this year alone, we expect that it'll cost U.S. businesses over $1 billion, and a lot of people have dealt with it. Over 40% of businesses have experienced some kind of attack, and a lot of them ended up paying the ransom because they did not have adequate protections in place or disaster recovery plans. Those that did, most took over a full business day to recover, which meant their business was not operational for that time. So when it comes to this presentation, we're going to talk a lot about email, because email is the top way that ransomware comes through, much like phishing attempts. Now, at Premier One, we do have several protections in place to try to limit your exposure to fraud, ransomware, and phishing attacks. So first and foremost, we have spam filtering. So every email that is sent to you first goes through a filter that we manage that looks for characteristics of these malicious emails and filters them out as best as it can. We also have firewalls in place to protect unauthorized access directly into your computer networks. And then we have endpoint protection software, which would be like antivirus that is installed on each computer in the network. And that really is to take care of any threats that make it through some of those other layers of security like spam filtering and firewalls. The biggest area where we can protect is not through technology, but through user education and awareness. The challenge with ransomware and phishing attacks is that technical measures can't catch everything. And the reason is the criminals are using the same type of technology that your business used for legitimate operations. So I want to start by taking a look at some examples. This is an email example of a phishing campaign. This is a real example, and it was sent to a number of customers. And so it says it's from USAA. There's been a restriction on a banking account, and it needs your information verified. Very common, and this is not legit at all. And I'll kind of take you through a few clues as to why that is. So first of all, at the very top, you'll see that the email address that it comes from is of Verizon.net. We would expect this to come from the official USAA domain. Next, the to field in the email says undisclosed recipients, which on its own isn't enough to determine that this is not legitimate, but it does raise a red flag. Next, you'll see the logo, which appears to be somewhat grainy and distorted, most likely not an official logo. And the next line is very telling. It says, "Dear customer, your bank is going to know who you are and address you by name, so it's very suspicious to see a generic email." Remember, phishing campaigns are sent out to thousands, if not millions of people, so they have to keep that introduction kind of generic. The next piece is probably the most telling. The hyperlink that they want you to click, first of all, it says that it's HTTP. When you're dealing with a bank or any place that deals with personal information, you'll want to be using a secure connection, which will be indicated by HTTPS rather than just HTTP. But what's even more telling here is when you hover over the link with your mouse, it shows the actual address that it's going to go to. And that address is something totally different than the text that's displayed. In this case, it's going to docufile.mx, which is a domain in Mexico. And ultimately, it leads you to a fake form that intends to steal your information. Finally, you'll notice a fair amount of variance between the text throughout the email. And then you also don't see a disclaimer that you normally would at the bottom of an email from a legitimate bank source. So overall, it doesn't have quite the professional look that you'd expect from a bank. And here's another example. This was a real email. What's interesting about this email is that it actually came from a real person from a real company. So Donna is actually a real user that corresponds with employees. What's interesting to note here, though, is that the link that she apparently has sent also goes to a website that tended to steal information. And what had ultimately happened in this case is that Donna's email had been compromised, and an attacker actually logged into her email account and started sending these kinds of messages to all of her contacts. And the important note here is that you always need to do your due diligence when dealing with emails, even if you know the person sending it. In this case, the person was known, but the recipient can't always know that the sender hasn't been compromised. So it's important to, even with messages coming from known parties, it's important that anything suspicious is still noted and that necessary precautions are taken. So next I want to jump into ransomware. One of the things that we first have to understand is how malicious files get into the network. And more we're seeing that come through malicious Word and Excel documents, which are frequently used to deliver ransomware. And that all boils down to a feature in Microsoft Office called macros. Macros are intended to help automate some things, make your life easier when working with big Word and Excel projects. But they can also be used for malicious purposes, and today that's what they're used for more than anything. And so I'm going to kind of go through some examples showing you malicious Microsoft Office documents and kind of explaining the differences here. But Microsoft did do something in 2007 to address this concern, and that was they introduced new file types. And you may have remembered when Office 2007 came out and you first saw Word documents that were .docx rather than the traditional .doc files. You may also notice the XLSX file that was introduced. And the key here is that these new formats with the X at the end, those automatically disallowed macros from running, which really prevented malicious software from running when you opened a Word or Excel document. However, traditional formats, doc and XLS, are still very common, and those are at risk because they do allow macros to run. So when we look at this in a real-world example, we see here's an example of an email that comes in that has both the new and the old style of attachments. So you'll see on the left those two attachments say .xls and .doc versus the ones on the right that are the new formats with the X at the end. And you'll also notice the icons are a bit different. On the left you have kind of an older style look to the icon, and the right is a bit newer. So the ones on the left are not necessarily for sure dangerous, but they have the potential to be dangerous, so you have to be extra careful. The ones on the right, however, don't allow macros to run, so they are essentially safe. So I'm going to show you now a live example of what this really looks like when it gets to your computer. So I'm going to open this up here, and in this folder I have a number of different files, some the old style of Word and Excel, some the new style, and I just want to highlight a few things here. First of all, you'll notice under the type column here, these say Microsoft Word document, and that indicates that it's the newer format or the docx format. However, if you look above that, you'll see several other files that say Word 97 to 2003 document. And that's your clue that this is the older format and is potentially dangerous. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the newer format. And this shows you what a typical malicious document kind of looks like. It has some stuff obscured and makes you think that you need to perform some action to see a very important message that has been blurred out or encrypted. And what it tells us to do is click the Enable Content button above if we want to see this alleged secure message. Well, we don't see an Enable Content button, and that's because Enable Content has to do with macros, and this new format for Word does not allow macros. Let me show you the exact same file, but I'm going to show you in the old Word format. So in this case, we see the same kind of text down below. To view your secure message, please click Enable Content above. However, in this version, we actually see a warning. It says macros have been disabled. Enable Content will turn those macros on. And when it comes to this level, this is really the only thing that is potentially protecting you from getting a ransomware infection. So if I were to click Enable Content now, we would see that some code has now executed on the computer, and we now receive pop-up that says all our data has been encrypted and we must pay a ransom. Otherwise, we won't get our data back. And that all happened through a macro in Microsoft Word. So the macros are very dangerous potentially, and often used for malicious purposes like that. So I want to show you a few other examples of malicious files that we've seen to kind of give you an idea of how the bad guys try to trick you. So this is another real example of a file attachment from an email. And in this case, you have kind of an official looking document that has the Microsoft Office logo, and it says, to view this message, you need to click Enable Content. And in this case, like my example, it actually executes some ransomware code that encrypts your files. Here's another example that makes it look like there's text that has been somewhat encrypted, and to see what the message actually says, you need to click Enable Content. Again, there is no secure message here. It's just a method to try to trick you into clicking that Enable Content button. And finally, here's an example, and I think this one's probably the scariest. The text of the document is actually blank, and so users might think that maybe something's wrong with this. Maybe I need to click Enable, otherwise I can't see it, and then they may click Enable and infect their company's network with ransomware. So those are a few screenshots, but I really want to take you through the entire process of how a ransomware infection happens, what kind of leads up to it, how it executes, and then what the aftermath looks like. So it all starts with an email. This is an excerpt from our spam filtering logs. This is a real example here, and we saw a big ransomware campaign on September 29th of 2016. Many emails all around the same time of the day coming from various Gmail addresses, all referencing some kind of receipt. Unfortunately, the spam filters could not identify this as a threat, and so it allowed the messages through. From there, the recipient would get a message that looked like this. Blank message, and just had an attachment with a receipt and a few random numbers. So just looking at this, you may have found it somewhat suspicious to begin with and sent it off to Premier One for analysis. If you weren't sure, you could send it to us. If you are pretty sure that it was a scam, just delete it. We don't need to check out everything, but if you're not quite sure and just want a second set of eyes, we'd be happy to take a look. So had you sent this to us, we would have looked at what's known as the email headers, and this is a view of the email kind of from a back end that shows a little bit more information. In here we have an apparent source and an IP address of 5.200. something. What we can do is actually look that IP address up and kind of get a little more information. And so when we do that, we found that IP address actually belonged to an internet provider in Iran. That would be enough of a clue to tell us that this is not a legitimate email and that it should be deleted. But let's say that you went ahead and opened the attachment anyway. First thing you would have noticed is that yellow bar at the top that talks about macros being disabled. You may also notice that the tab name appears to be in a foreign language, but say you hadn't really noticed that and clicked Enable Content. Well, you wouldn't really see anything on the screen, but in the background, ransomware would infect your computer and start encrypting all of your files to kind of an unusable state. So you'll see a file on the left here was some clearly readable text, and after ransomware infection takes place, that file now looks like what's on the right. So completely unreadable, unusable. Unfortunately, the bad guys are the only ones with the keys to turn what's on the right back into what's on the left. And once all your files are encrypted, you'll get a pop-up of some sort that looks like this. So it says, all your files have been encrypted, you need to pay us money, and by the way, you need to do that quick. Otherwise, we will destroy any chance of you going back and unencrypting your files, or maybe they won't destroy it, but they'll raise the price on you. To sum up everything with ransomware and phishing and fraud, there's a few email tips that you need to be aware of. First of all, know that anybody can spoof the from address of an email. That means that just because an email says it's from a certain address doesn't mean that it actually came from that person. Second, you need to always verify wire transactions outside of email. Pick up the phone if you get a request to change a wire. You call them. Don't let them call you, because attackers can fraudulently call you as well. Make sure to hover over links in your emails. You see many attacks that come through that the text of the link says one thing, but the actual link that it's going to is somewhere totally different. And that's a big red flag. Also consider that whoever's sending you email could have their account compromised. So even if you get an email from a legitimate person that you do business with, you still need to hover over links or verify wire transactions if they're asking you to do something that's out of the ordinary. Next, be very careful with Word, Excel, and other Microsoft attachments that you get in email. Do not click Enable Content on an Office document unless you're 100% sure that the file is legit and requires macros to operate correctly. And if you aren't 100% sure about something, ask somebody. Submit a ticket to Premier One and we'll be happy to take a look. I hope this presentation has been helpful and informative, and thank you for viewing.